Señoras y señores, bienvenidos to episode 2 de La Yuma Cubana. Today we're going to be discussing the Bay of Pigs invasion, or what's better known in Cuba as La Batalla de Girón. It has oxymoronically been referred to as the perfect failure. As some of you may know, this was the unsuccessful military invasion of Cuba, sponsored by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, of the United States to arm and train a group of counter-revolutionary exiles in order to go and overthrow Fidel Castro. So to set the stage a little bit, this is the late 1950s, and the US-backed Cuban dictator at that time was Fulgencio Batista, who was overthrown himself. And on New Year's Eve, 1958, he fled Cuba. This in turn allowed Fidel's rebel army to emerge from the Sierra Maestra and march from Santiago to Havana, which took about a week, as Cuba's new leader. This was in January 1959. Shortly thereafter, reforms started to take place, which included the expropriation of land, and some of that land was related to U.S. economic assets and companies. This would mark the beginning of hostility in the relationship between Cuba and the U.S., the first of many dominoes to fall in this chain reaction. In April of that same year, Fidel, to kind of smooth things over and take a pulse, he went to go visit Washington, D.C. Now, by this time, there was already an alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union, and so there was some concern considering it was during the Cold War. So in a statement, Fidel, to ease minds, he said, and I quote, "I know you are worried, but I want to be very, very clear. We are no communists. Very clear." End quote. The objective was to be recognized as the new leader of Cuba. He intended on meeting with the U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, who wanted nothing to do with him and went to go play golf, and deflected the meeting instead to the Vice President Richard Nixon. Throughout the following year, the alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union grew stronger. Fast forward, February 1960. The Vice Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, the number 2 man in the Kremlin, Anastas Mikoyan, went to Cuba. Him and Fidel agreed on a contract that stated the Soviet Union would procure 1 million tons of sugar per year for the next 5 years. In addition, Cuba would be given a $100 million credit so they could buy raw materials, equipment, and anything else they needed to build up this new infrastructure. Now, Anastas was the first Soviet government official to visit Cuba, and when Eisenhower saw images of him wearing a straw hat, sipping on Bacardi, he was like, holy cow, Cuba's going to become an outpost for the Soviet Union. Considering the geographical proximity between the States and Cuba, which is a mere 105 miles or 170 kilometers, this was way too close for comfort. So the next month, in March, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to start putting together a plan of recruiting Cuban exiles in Miami, Florida. Then in June, that same year, 1960, a Soviet Union tanker pulls up to Havana Harbor, carrying 300,000 tons of crude oil. At that time, Texaco, Shell, and Esso were in Cuba. And you needn't be Nostradamus to know that when Fidel asked these companies to refine this oil, they said no. So when they refused, Fidel went ahead and confiscated these U.S. oil refineries. In retaliation, Eisenhower cut off the Cuban sugar import as an economic blockage. Fidel said, dale, and he confiscated even more U.S. companies, including sugar, phone, bank, and electric. So that same summer of 1960, it was unanimously decided that it would be in the U.S. national interest to get rid of Fidel Castro. So by September, Fidel was already privy to this scheme, and he flew over to New York, uninvited, to attend the United Nations General Assembly. He said he would be making a brief statement, and he spoke for 4.5 hours, calling interference on the United States, saying that they were meddling in Cuban internal affairs. Initially, Fidel's accommodations were to be at the elite Shelbourne Hotel located in Midtown. However, they started receiving a lot of adverse publicity. And perhaps as a strategy to make Fidel and his men leave, they said that the stay would have to be paid in full up front, which was an exorbitant amount of money. The New York tabloids alleged, and it sounds totally plausible to me, that Fidel's crew, these uncouth primitives, were plucking and cooking chickens inside the hotel room. putting out their cigars on the expensive carpets. However, later it was said that this was merely staged as a form of retaliation. Fidel then threatened to camp out on UN grounds until Hotel Teresa in Harlem offered them to stay there for free. During his stay at Hotel Teresa, Fidel was visited by the creme de la creme, including Nikita Khrushchev, also the Indian Prime Minister, the Egyptian President, and Malcolm X. And all the while, 1,400 Cuban exiles begin their training in Guatemala. They are known as Brigade 2506. They undergo infantry lessons, combat formations, instruction on demolition, driving tanks, heavy weapons, and parachuting. One of the men from the brigade said that for breakfast they would have powdered eggs, for lunch it would be Spam, bread, and Kool-Aid, and for dinner it would be Kool-Aid, Spam, and bread. Allegedly, an additive was put inside the Kool-Aid to curtail sexual drive. For these individuals, they were the happiest men alive. They were going to be the saviors of Cuba. They were going to go and overthrow this dictator, establish democracy in their homeland, and be reunited with their family. It was going to be glorious. This was a very hush-hush, covert, keep it on the down low operation. Then in January of 1961, New York Times headlines, U.S. helps train an anti-Castro force at a secret Guatemala air-ground base. Shh. Be very, very quiet. I'm hunting communists. Way to go, New York Times. As a CIA agent so eloquently offered the metaphor, you cannot cover an elephant with a handkerchief. I'll give you a moment to marinate on that. So what else was crack-a-lackin'? Well, the U.S. presidential elections were. John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon by 120,000 votes, making him the 35th president of the United States. Let's pause. From a chronological perspective, this was devised and formulated by Eisenhower. It was denied by Nixon, who didn't even bother telling JFK because he was so overly optimistic that he'd win. This was denounced by Fidel at the United Nations, and now it was being inherited by John F. Kennedy. Overthrowing the Soviet Union's key ally in the Western Hemisphere, during the Cold War to boot, proved to be a tricky maneuver. John F. Kennedy was faced with two opposing objectives, one of which was to overthrow Fidel Castro, and the second was to establish better relations with the Soviet Union. He was kind of at a fork in the road, damned if I do, damned if I don't. The former being a possible escalation of World War III, nuclear apocalypse, not to mention world opinion. The latter being, at this time, there were more than 50 exile groups of every political hue that were pissed that they had to leave Cuba, abandon their property, their businesses, their families. They wanted to see Fidel toppled. And so if JFK had this opportunity to do that, and he didn't take it, pow, he would be perceived as a weak leader by some. Also, JFK was just getting acclimated to his new role as president, becoming acquainted with his team of advisors, the new environment. So he did a lot of pussyfooting around. And then on April 4th, there was a decisive meeting where a green light was given to proceed. Who was the brains behind this whole thing? Well, the key architect was a gentleman by the name of Richard Bizzle. Dickie, if you're nasty. He was the CIA Deputy Director of Plan. I didn't even know such an appellation existed, but it does, DDP. The original plan called for the landing point to be in Trinidad, which was a heavily populated city, still is. The first advantage of this spot being that it would be ideal for the uprising of the masses to join forces with the Cuban exiles. In addition, there was a hospital that was housing 5,000 political prisoners. So these exiles were around 1,400 versus the 20 to 30,000 soldiers that Fidel had in his militia. The second advantage was the Escambray Mountains. If anything went awry, the exiles would be able to escape and hide in these mountains. However, John F. Kennedy wanted to, and I quote, reduce noise level. So he gave his team 3 days to come back with a new landing spot. And they did. They chose the Bay of Pigs, Playa Girón, which is about 100 miles west of Trinidad, that is surrounded by swamps without any escape route. Playa Girón is beautiful. I've been there. If you want to work on your suntan and and sip on mojitos and catch up on some reading, it is muy bueno, thumbs up all the way. However, if you want to reenact a World War II amphibious landing, yeah, I would say that's under the category of no bueno, not a good idea. This should have been Dickey's cue to say, well, Mr. President, under these new conditions, I cannot guarantee success. Instead, he acted as a yes man, and nobody dared contradict the golden boy, because apparently everything that Dickey touched before this was like, oh. So these invasion plans were constantly being tweaked, and not trivial aspects, but predominant ones like the landing site, which, by the way, the Bay of Pigs happened to be Fidel's favorite fishing spot. He went there every summer, knew it like the back of his hand. So let's take a moment to review assumptions here. And remember, to assume makes an ass out of U-M-E. First of all, there would be a massive uprising, that the invasion of the Cuban exiles would serve as an impetus for the Cuban people. Secondly, if anything did go south, JFK would change his mind about sending U.S. troops in. In the traditional style of chess mentality, the forward thinking, Fidel proactively deployed an enormously effective anti-terrorism strategy, which was, oye, abre ahí. They knocked on every house, on every block. And if that person had an association with a military unit and they could be trusted, they were given a gun. However, if you did not have an association with the military unit, you were incarcerated. Punto. Period. Over 100,000 people were being held at the ballpark stadium, and another 5,000 in Blanquita Theater. This managed to break apart any internal resistance, or at least most of it. Then on April 12, 1961, there was a press conference in which a reporter asked President Kennedy, "Has a decision been reached on how this country will be willing to go in helping anti-Castro uprising in Cuba?" To which President Kennedy retorted, "First of all, let me just say, there will not be under any conditions an intervention in Cuba by the United States Armed Forces." End quote. This is 5 days before the invasion. So one of the preliminary tasks was the annihilation of Cuba's Air Force. This was a fundament to the plan. The skies had to be clear in order for these Cuban exiles to unload themselves and their equipment at Playa Girón. So the CIA reached out to Alabama's International Guard personnel to assist in the training and advising of the Cuban exiles to fly, arm, and maintain 16 Douglas B-26 Sea Invaders. Why were they chosen? Well, because they were the last American flying unit to use these obsolete B-26 bombers, which were being used by the Cuban military at the time. These 16 aircrafts were painted in Cuban colors, along with the Cuban insignia. They were even given actual numbers of real Cuban Air Force B-26s, in an attempt to trick the Cuban people into thinking that the local military was revolting against Fidel, triggering this massive uprising. So these planes were pimped out. We're talking 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, 5-inch rocket launchers, 250-gallon drop tanks. Keep in mind that the Cuban B-26s didn't have any of these features. The gun turrets were literally taken out and replaced by fuel tanks. Why? Well, it was a 6-hour round trip between Nicaragua and Cuba. Did I say Nicaragua? Yes, I did. Initially, the training of the Cuban exiles was being held in Guatemala. However, the people there were like, listen, you ain't got to go home, but you got to get up on out of here. This training Cuban exiles on our homeland, we don't want anything to do with it. So they moved to Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua. So 6-hour round trip from Nicaragua to Cuba. In addition, they wanted at least 30 minutes in the target area. Then on the 15th of April, in an attempt to destroy Fidel's air capability, these 16 B-26 bombers were to wreak havoc on the Cuban island. However, JFK, in an order to reduce noise level, he fruit ninja'd this plan, and instead of 16, it became 8 B-26 bombers. 6 of them flew near Havana, whereas the other 2 went more towards Guantanamo Bay. They were to jettison their gas tanks and destroy all aircraft parked in the field. One of the aircrafts by the call name of Linda 3 was in trouble from the get-go. The wing-mounted drop tank refused to feed fuel into the main tank. The pilot, Alfredo Massa, couldn't even fire his guns. He knew that he wouldn't be able to make it back to Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua. So he diverted to the British Cayman Islands, which was en route, where his aircraft was immediately interned. And the head guy there was like, "Sir, you can't leave your plane here. No, no, no. Oh, it's tea time. Sir, would you like to have a spot of tea?" So these two Cuban exiles sat down with this guy's wife and his kids, and they had some tea. The next day, the Cuban exiles flew back on a British commercial flight back to Miami, Florida. Now, there was a ninth bomber that was staged with bullet holes and everything. It flew from Nicaragua straight to Miami, Florida. The pilot's story was that they had defected from Castro's Air Force, stolen the plane, and assumed credit for the airfield attacks. Aviation savvy reporters noted that the machine guns on the plane had never been fired. And number two, the metal gun nose of the C model was different than that of the plexiglass bombardier noses that you find on the Cuban B-26 bombers. One of these things is not like the other, not to mention a fresh coat of paint. So this fooled no one, not the press nor the public. So then it became blatantly obvious that the U.S. did indeed have some involvement. So then at the United Nations, the Cuban Foreign Minister, Raul Rola, denounced vandalistic and aggressive attacks against Cuba by the U.S. These allegations were rejected categorically by the U.S. Ambassador, Adlai Stevenson. But to Mr. Stevenson's defense, he wasn't in the know. And a lot of people were humiliated that should have known and didn't. There were also civilian casualties as a result of these airstrikes. One of the individuals that was injured, before he died, he wrote Fidel on a wooden block in his own blood. The Cuban exile reported that 75 to 80% of the Air Force had indeed been demolished. So the CIA saw no reasons for follow-up air attacks until the U.S. Air Force U-2 revealed aerial photos of the remaining operational jets, and they were greater than that of what was indicated on the reports. So the CIA, at the last minute, put together some attacks for the following day to kind of finish the job. However, considering the world outcry and to avoid further aggravation of the Latin American allies to the U.S., not to mention the Soviet Union, JFK wanted to reduce the noise level. You guys are at about a 7. I need you at a 5. So then later on that same evening, JFK canceled these follow-up airstrikes. So nothing happened on the 16th. On the 17th of April, the Bay of Pigs went down. At 0600 hours, Brigade 2506 takes off. It's believed that Fidel had this brigade infiltrated, so this may or may not have come as a surprise. Immediately, the ships are attacked while unloading. An account of the initial exchange was, the Cuban exile said in Spanish, "We are the Army of Liberation, and we are here to overthrow communism." To which the Cuban militia replied, "Patria or muerte, viva Fidel," which translates to, "Homeland or death, live on Fidel." At 6:20, the supply ship the Houston is taken down 5 miles offshore. At 7:30 a.m., 117 paratroopers are dropped from the sky. 9:30 a.m., Rio Escondido takes a direct rocket hit. Now, this is a precious ship. This is a precious ship because it is carrying 10 days of medical equipment, ammunition, food, and gasoline. The rest of the ships haul ass back to international waters and claim safe, leaving the Cuban exile forces marooned, and I guess the equivalency would be caca out of luck, without any reinforcements or way of resupply. April 18th, the National Security Advisor told President Kennedy, "The Cuban armed forces are stronger. The population response is weaker, and our tactical position is more feeble than we initially thought." As a last-ditch effort, the CIA authorizes Alabamians from the International Guardsmen to go to Cuba. However, they were warned, if you are caught, you will be considered mercenaries, and we will disavow you. Regardless of this grim prospect, they went anyways. Remember, these guys trained with these Cuban exiles, and they shared meals and stories, and they got to know one another. They had rapport. Yes, they slept in separate sleeping quarters because the Cubans were going to speak Spanish and the Americans were going to speak English, and it would have been like arroz con mango, but they were comrades. And so these guys didn't want the Cuban exiles to feel like they had been forsaken. One of the planes was shot down and went into the water. The bodies were never recovered. The second plane saw this, and he hugged the water, went full throttle, and flew into the sun, and he managed to evade his attacker. The third plane crashed. The pilot survived, but because they resisted arrest, they were shot. One of those pilots had Hispanic features, like dark hair, dark eyes, so they buried him with the rest of the Cuban exiles. However, the other pilot, Pete Ray, had his body frozen for 18 years in a Havana morgue. Fidel wanted to hold on to it as proof of U.S. involvement. Then his daughter pushed and persisted, and finally on December 1979, his body was brought back over to the States to be given a proper military burial. April 19th. Less than 72 hours, the resistance ended. It was estimated that more than 100 Cuban exiles were killed and over 1,100 were captured. They served 18 to 20 months in a Cuban prison, which I'm sure was not fun and games. Then in 1962, they were released in exchange for $53 million worth of medical supplies and baby food. Playa Girón has a museum based on the Bay of Pigs. However, it's all in Spanish, so unless you can read Spanish, you have to bring a translator or a guide with you. Also note that there's a huge billboard that reads in Spanish, "This marks the first defeat of Yankee imperialism in Latin America." A few months later, Ernesto Che Guevara met with advisor and speechwriter of the Kennedy administration, Richard Goodwin. And he said, "Thank you very much for the Bay of Pigs." No, that's a Cuban accent. Sorry, I can't do an Argentinian accent. But basically, he thanked him for the Bay of Pigs, confessing that before that it was somewhat of a fragmented situation. And then post, it became this David and Goliath story, which was kind of a verbal, diplomatic whoosh, bitch slap in the face. This indeed did give Cuba this unmitigated triumph, this unprecedented legitimacy for the revolution. Not to mention the blemish on the shiny new Kennedy administration. He felt bamboozled. He had been assured that these exiles would be able to go without and defeat Castro without any U.S. intervention whatsoever. So let's double back. The U.S. fear that Cuba would fall into the embrace of the Soviet Union. Kind of like jealousy has the opposite effect of what you intend it to. We will soon see how this act that was taken out of fear will manifest itself into the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. This concludes episode 2, Bay of Pigs, Batalla de Girón. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned some things. And until next time, take care. Cuídate. Ciao.